So I'm going to talk a little bit about mediation holistically, and then hopefully I can answer any questions that you have about your respective states, because here's how Iowa got ag mediation on the map. So back in 1985, what do we know about the ag world? Was it awesomeness? Said nobody ever, right? Okay, so here's what happened. We had an executive director come from Missouri who had the idea of starting ag mediation in the state of Iowa. Normally, we know legislation takes a long time to get put in place, right? But in 1985, there was a farmer from Hills, Iowa, who was set to lose his homestead and his farm ground. And in a state of despondency, he made the choice to go to the bank, who at that time he blamed for what was happening, and ended up killing the banker and tried to take some lives along the way and eventually took his own. We were the reason that the tractor rides went across the nation, if you remember any of those. And so Governor Branstad at that time had the wherewithal to immediately put us on the map. And so we went into law in 1985. And so we were the very first in the nation to actually create agricultural mediation programs. Now, the reason why I was asking people where you're from is because every state handles mediation differently. So I'm going to try to talk about mediation as a whole, and then I'm going to try to talk about the Coalition of Agricultural Mediation Programs. Because if you live in a state that is part of the coalition, it has signed contracts with the USDA as part of the Farm Bill, and mediation services are actually wider than we might think. Okay, so any first questions about that? I have been with IMS for over a decade. I am also one of 2 master facilitators for the International Farm Transition Network. And we teach, actually where I was at for the 5 hours before this, teaching a class. It's relevant because if you have a state with an ag mediation program, the Farm Bill actually also allows them to do farm succession planning. So important to know the umbrella is wider than just standard mediation practices. So any questions about that before we rock and roll?
Do you know what states have or the coalition of mediation?
You're going to steal my thunder. I'm going to talk about this. So 1985, we were the first. Immediately thereafter, Minnesota followed suit, also a mandatory state. That's going to be an important distinction here pretty soon. As of today, there are 44 states. I've also been led to believe that there have been 2 that have applied and 1 that they're unsure of because of the world that we live in right now with some uncertainty. That's all we'll say about that. So every state has to recertify, and the recertification process happens in August. And so if you are part of a state that has a program, some government entity within that state has to solely designate them to do the work. So for us, it's the Attorney General's office. For some, it's the governor, the Secretary of Ag. Somebody has to say, this is your point, which is why I'm giving you a handout in bright colors that actually shows, we'll just do this in fun way, right? Shows the map. That map, so I actually wrote this white paper on behalf of the coalition because we call ourselves CAMP, Coalition of Agricultural Mediation Programs. And I serve as the president right now, and so I'll have another 2 years of doing that. So that's why I can speak to who is in the program, who's not. So Puerto Rico is an area that is served, but they aren't actually designated yet as a separate entity. So I believe theirs is being done through New Mexico. Okay. So if you ask me questions, I've been doing this for a decade. We'll see if I can answer. So there's 44 if that is helpful. So you're going to hear me say CAMP, Coalition of Agricultural Mediation Programs. So I don't have to say that 75 times. If I say IMS, Iowa Mediation Service, and we are the sole designee for the state of Iowa and the first. And so we are the ones that programs tend to look at for advice. And then when I say IFTN, that's the International Farm Transition Network. Joy Kirkpatrick out of Wisconsin and myself are the two who we do train the trainer workshops. And so any questions you have kind of in that realm, I'll try to answer for you.
Before you move on, clarity, the 44, they get funding from the Farm Bill to have mediators doing ag mediation? Maybe?
Yes, although that is unsure at this particular moment because of funding stuff. So I'm going.
But historically, when you said it was tied to the Farm Bill.
Yes,
Okay.
so it's tied to the
Yeah,
Farm
yes.
Bill. So the Farm Bill of 2018 is the one that's guiding us right now. So we're in a continuation and we're thinking they'll be in 2025. And so I spend a lot of time working with legislators trying to figure that out.
Wow.
Because within the bill, it actually says what is considered a covered case for ag mediations. So yes, we're under a grant, and this is important for everybody to know. If you're in a state that has one of these programs, although they get federal funds, they have to support the grant on their own means by at least 30%. So they're generating things some other way as well. So whether that's their state, they charge for services. We garner a lot of IMS through trainings. So just know that it's a yes and. And right now, because we don't have word yet about the certification, we're just all moving forward as though it's been historically. And we'll see how it pans out.
What was the first Farm Bill that it was funded?
Okay, so that if you go to
I just asked my question.
it's in on the back sheet. So it was a state federal partnership in 1988. So to give context, it took about 3 years because Iowa was 1985, Minnesota was 1986, and then it was part of the Ag Credit Act of 87, which launched it then in 88. And there has not been a gap in service really since 1985. IMS has never not served a year, and since 1988, there has been at least a myriad of programs involved with CAMI. So
I know you got to get started, but
it's great for you.
your program, IMS, how many mediators do you guys have in Iowa?
Oh, good question. So, and this is, every state is going to be a little bit different as well. Some states have staff mediators on hand who are fully funded as employees, and they're probably doing more than one thing. Like me, I'm executive director, I'm the trainer, I do keynote speaking, I write books, and then I also mediate. Okay, so we have 6 of us in the state of Iowa to do that. But to cover all 99 counties, we have what are called contract practitioners. And we know the pods in Iowa, and we have it mapped out where there's no 90-minute radius that isn't covered by somebody, whether that's one of us or somebody who's contracting. And that list of names can change because we're always trying to strike the balance of having practitioners who aren't spread too thin. And also there has to be the work volume so their skills stay up. And so we saw the ag volume go down. And what do we know about it now? So case in point, Iowa would have days where we would get no cases. We would have days where we would get 2 to 4 cases, and realize that every case that comes in does not necessarily become something that sits at the table. But last week we had 32 cases in one day. So to give context of the change there, and our mediations in Iowa are not transactional credit based. Minnesota's tend to be more that way. So when the ones we have filed with us are long, complicated, lots of dollars. So imagine what that's going to take to have practitioners if all 32 of those hit the ground at the same time. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about this in a bit too. In the state of Iowa, there are time frames on mediation. So we wouldn't have the luxury of being able to say, oh, there's too many for this day. But some states have that luxury. And that's why I was trying to ferret out where people are from. So I'm going to try to talk universally and hopefully answer the questions that you also have. Just as a word of information, the vast majority of the programs in camp are not mandatory states. They would like to be mandatory states. And it's extremely hard to get that position. So you want to know that.
Who designates the mandatory states? Mandatory by what?
mandatory by the state.
Oh.
In Minnesota, it's by statute.
Yep, it's by statute. So they were the second to follow. So Iowa was first. We're Iowa Code Chapter 654 A, B, and C.
Oh, wow.
And Minnesota's criteria is really very just I shouldn't say just, it's very transactional based mediation work. Where like North Dakota, South Dakota, theirs might be different. Even there. So, good question. Any other questions before I rock and roll? And keep asking questions, because honestly, this is not for me. I know these programs. I'd rather have you all know about it, right? Okay, so I want to remind people what mediation is, because I have discovered as of late, when I'm working with people, there is this feeling of like, oh my gosh, we're going to court. Oh my gosh, we're going to law. Like there's such like a legal presence that I almost wish that wasn't part of the name, because what we're trying to do is to create conversation using a neutral third party. And so it's equally important to know that mediation is always voluntary. Not necessarily voluntary to go to mediation, but the process itself needs to be voluntary. So people feel worried like, well, I don't want to be backed in the corner or I don't want to have to write my name to an agreement. Part of our intake process is to say, rest assured, this is your agreement if you get one. And you're only beholden to what you agree to. So that can relieve a lot of anxiety. And then also to know that anything that is disclosed in a mediation is confidential. So for instance, in Iowa, they have tried to have mediators have to testify, and those get quashed immediately. Because that's part of why it works, is that mediators are provided confidentiality. Now, the keynote to distinguish though is that if you write an agreement and you take that with you, then that's for public consumption, right? But whatever happens behind conversational doors stays there. And in fact, most good practitioners will tell people that they will actually destroy all of their notes upon conclusion of reaching an agreement. Two kinds of mediations can happen. One is at the table. So that would be like, let's say all of us have decided that we hate each other. And the mediation were like this. I would be a facilitator. We would all be sitting here. There could be a time though, where all of a sudden my friend Ben gets hot-headed and I need to change the temperature. I may decide to do what's called caucusing. And so if you're from the area of Iowa, it's not presidential caucusing. Lawyers use it all the time. All it means is a private session. So if you are somebody engaging in services with a mediator, it is good and okay to ask in advance what their mediation preference is. Because if you are somebody who wants table time and you're working with a mediator who solely believes in the caucusing model, you might have a disconnect, right? Our philosophy at IMS, and it's not normally in keeping with attorneys in the room. We don't prefer shovel diplomacy or caucusing. We believe that we want people to sit at the table because we are a short-term intervention. Whatever relationships are there, we want to sustain after we have left. So the more we can keep people at the table talking, the more they'll be equipped for the relationships they do or don't want to have after we're done. Okay? Okay, so what does the mediator do? Their job is to help parties see new options and negotiate changes. Because keep in mind that might seem obvious, but if it were that obvious, they wouldn't need a mediator. So they're there because seeing those things aren't necessarily evident. So our job is to do gap analysis and to be hope brokers. So hope brokers means that, my word I coined, but basically that in all cases, there is some kind of point of agreement. Even if they don't walk away with an agreement, even if they agree that they can't have a relationship moving forward, the mediator can help memorialize and articulate words they can't necessarily say themselves. So, I already talked about agreements are party driven. And this is especially important because how many of you are attorneys in the room? 3. Okay. It is not uncommon for attorneys to be asked when they're mediating, what will happen? What's the legal advice? What, right? I see it, the attorney shaking their head. And you may think, well, that doesn't apply to me because I'm not an attorney. Well, I came into the practice as a human resource manager prior to. And I'll get people who will lean on me and be like, well, doesn't that violate X? Shouldn't we write this job description? And they're trying to lean on us as experts. And so I remind them that a mediator is an expert of the process. The participants are the expert of their conflict. Okay? So it is still okay though, and it should be expected that if you're sitting in a mediation, they are likely going to be bringing people with them. So they're not a party to the agreement, but they are participating. I have very, very few, I can't even hardly think of any recently, debtor creditor ones where both parties haven't invited attorneys. And so people might be thinking, well, that seems really like cost prohibitive. You're paying your attorney and them. But we can expedite things that make it faster so that their hourly rate with the attorney is still less than if they were trying to do it in their own universe. People also bring accountants, financial planners, and they also bring their spouses. And so people will say, well, what, how can they have a say in this? And I'm like, don't kid yourself. Where somebody's head hits their pillow at night has more impact than just about anything in this universe, right? And so when you're working with a mediator, they are going to be trying to figure out who is there as a support role and who is there as a party to the agreement. And that can be really interesting and challenging with spouses because sometimes they wear dual hats. Because if you have like cross collateralization or if they're signed on one thing but not another. So to really know the documents that you're trying to support and understand is important for the mediator. Because once an agreement is reached, it is a binding contract. And so that's where we want people to really, really understand that when they sign an agreement, they are signing an agreement for future action. So as a mediator, I'm also going to be doing what's called reality testing. Because I could want to pay $1 million note back. Be like, yep, I'm going to pay you. I'm going to sign this agreement. And I still might want to reality test that, right? Because my bias as a mediator would be, if you could have paid it, why didn't you pay it yesterday before we got here, right? But I have to check that bias as a mediator. So I'm just simply going to ask the question, tell me about that. Reality test that for me about paying. Well, my family's closing on an estate next week and I'm going to be inheriting $5 million. Oh, well, that's information, right? And so reality testing makes sure that the mediator stays out of their own way to make sure that they are really understanding if something can or can't happen. So if you were sitting at the table with me, and you can do this even with your farm clients and world in any setting, is if somebody says something to you that just seems like that is not realistic. I'll ask questions like, okay, play that out to the logical or illogical end. Let's play out that scenario in 1 week, 1 year, 10 years. Because if I tell them something can or can't happen, or isn't good, then I'm taking ownership and it's no longer party driven. Right? So part of reality testing, and if you want people to engage in their own conflict, believe you me, my kids hate having me as a mama because I'm always like, play it out for me. Like, if you get a bad grade, do I own it or do you? Let's play that out in 1 year, 10 years. Okay? Okay, so we talked about mediation. You asked about the time. So there's 1988. 44 states known as CAM. Okay. To give you a little bit of background information on Iowa, we have handled over 50,000 farmer creditor cases. And what is important to note is our agreement rate. And I can tell you, as the person who writes the white pages for CAM, on average, every state has an agreement rate of 70% or higher. And so that tells you that when you can get somebody at the table, good things happen. Now, what I will say though is in Iowa, so I can't attest if this is the same in other states. When we get cases in, we use a mindset of what we call a third, a third, a third. A third of the cases, people will decide not to participate in at all. A third of the cases, the notification of mediation will be enough to get them to change behaviors. I don't like that, right? And then a third of them will go to the table. So when you look at this number here, during 2023 and 2024, this is CAMP's overall number. We saw 7,150 ag requests. 5,000 of them were fulfilled. And last year, the agreement rate was a little bit lower than normal, about 70% instead of 80%. Who would like to tell me why they think that agreement rate has dropped? Your mediators stink.
The shifting conditions. I said the shifting conditions with tariffs and land prices.
But even look before, because tariffs is a new thing. This is 23 and 24, right? So in line with that though, why would our agreement rates be less?
Are you doing fewer face-to-face mediations?
That could be some of it, because we know that COVID changed things. And we can talk about that as well. So prior to COVID, states like Iowa didn't even allow Zooms. And then Governor Reynolds put us on a hiatus for a tiny bit while they tried to figure out the universe. And then we figured out that COVID wasn't just going to be a spring break phenomenon. It was around for a hot minute, right? And so we went to Zoom. I think that is some of it. I also think a lot of the issues that we deal with agriculture, not everybody is necessarily even living on the farms to which they're having disagreements about. So that even changes, like, do you have the same feeling? I'm dealing with a farm family right now where there's 4 siblings and only one lives in the state of Iowa. So does that change dynamics? Also, the level of lending and cost that it requires means that it's no longer feasible for a lot of people to even enter into farming, let alone maintain it. So when we get cases, they're complicated, right? So I can show you Iowa code here in a bit. It was written in 1985 and it's never been changed. But what it said is if there was going to be a foreclosure action on any ag connected, something that was ag connected with a homestead of $20,000 or greater, mediation had to be allowed. What do we know about $20,000 in ag mediation now? We have equipment repairs that cost more than that. So last year, we had a couple of cases. I'm gonna think about how many, at least 4, if not 5, that exceeded $10 million each case. Okay. So you're talking, that's gonna take a hot minute. We actually had one that exceeded 20 million.
In Minnesota until recently was 5,000 and it just went up to 15. So we're at 15. We're at 15. We're at 15. For some people it's a whole lot of money. And for some people it's
And in Iowa, if you were to say 20,000, most people would roll their eyes and be like, that's hobby farming. And we have to contend with that too, because everybody gets a seat at the table. Everybody's story matters, whether it's 5 acres or 5,000 acres, right? 5 head of cattle or 5,000 head of cattle.
I'm just going to ask him this number. Is the 5,000 compared to the 7,000 because of the third, or is it because you're going to be listening to? So everybody gets, everyone who requests it gets paid. Mostly.
Not necessarily. So in Iowa and Minnesota, one, they aren't going to be requesting mediation. It's going to be a mandate of the state that they have to. And so they are going to get it. Now, there could be some states where, and even in Iowa, let's say they request an ag mediation, but it doesn't fall under the covered cases. They may request it, but it isn't something that can be mediated. Does that make sense? But as a general rule, it's because a third of the participants, something is happening, right? So I'm going to put this back up here, the Coalition of Agricultural Mediation Programs and the map. What I would encourage is when you go back to your respective offices that you actually Google camp, because when you do, you can actually drive into the site and see the states, see the contacts, you see more about it. Okay. I can also give almost every name for every state if you have one though. So
Does the website track the additional topics that each state has added? if
Yep.
any?
and that
Those four on the side are baffling that they don't have it because those are really ag heavy states.
these four.
Yes.
So let's play that out in theory.
Okay.
Longer question. So why could that be?
They don't want to put state funding into it?
You don't want to put state funding into it. And if you're a banker, do you want mediation to be a service that is required?
Nope.
Right. So it is, we have a lot of the mindset of, well,
Wait,
this is good
play
for
that
all.
out. Why, if you're a banker, you don't want mediation to be involved?
Because there's a misperception. So I don't know the exact statistics, but when Iowa became a mandatory state, I think that something like 10 to 20,000 cases were dropped in the first year from bankers hoping to save the program because they looked at it as a threat.
Yeah.
Like, well, you're going to make this harder. Maybe we don't have to repay things. Once, though, states understand what it does, they become some of our best allies. It's also the why Minnesota didn't open up their laws properly. So if you were to talk to Mary Nell, she would say that if you open up the law, you could have other lobbying groups be like, take it. That's why IMS has never challenged the code from 1985. Because even if it is 20,000, we're like, okay, because to put yourself out there means you could have other groups that challenge it.
And that's why we agreed to it going up to 15. It was sort of a deal. You know, the banking organizations, lobbyists wouldn't push back too hard if we agreed to raise it from 5 to 15.
Because that would mean any of the cases that normally were caught between 5 and 15 no longer have to go to mediation.
Yeah, it was
It could mean that you request it and you invite it, but it doesn't have to happen. So, great question. That would be my guess as to why. So, Arizona's reasons is a little bit different, but I won't belabor that. But they have their own reasons. They've been in and then out. So, okay. So, to answer your question then about what can or can't be mediated is based on the Farm Bill. Okay. So, the way it started was more like what Iowa and Minnesota were doing, Denner Kromer. You have a farm, I'm a banker, you didn't pay your bill, shame on you. Now I'm going to make you go to mediation. We said, figure out repayment, something like that, right? So that's that part. It's been expanded to wetland determinations, compliance with farm programs. So when you talked about NRCS, things like that, okay? So the different programs, if there's compliance, conservation, organic, forestry is another one, pesticide issues, lease issues, and that can include land lease and equipment lease. Okay? So another, yes, go for it.
Sorry, finish your sentence, we'll go back.
No, you,
Okay, question is partly with lease issues and loan issues. Can they be mediated if a lease or a loan hasn't been completed? Like, could failure to be awarded a lease or a loan be mediated?
okay, so the question is, I'm supposed to repeat questions back. So your question is, what would happen to a lease or a loan
If it has failed.
if it had failed? Okay? So when you say failed, like let's use the loan example. Do you mean that like
Didn't get noticed.
they didn't get the loan? Okay. So those are kind of different questions.
Okay.
Yes, we can do work with leases and loans for things that didn't happen, depending on some of the criteria. Right? Also though, if somebody is in the midst of losing their ground or equipment because of land lease issues, equipment issues, we can do those as well. Cool. So kind of different things. And where it gets a little bit gray is the idea of leasing also now is part of the world of farm transition planning. So I had somebody who was one of my staff doing a case last week where really it was they can't afford to have their farm manager anymore. And they had the farm manager got to live on the homestead as part of payment and got to use equipment for their own land. Okay, things we're very familiar with, right? So what happened when we're mid-cycle of the year and they say that he has to be done in December? December is not a logical, normal time other than it's the end of a calendar year. But in terms of agriculture, it means nothing, right? So this particular group, the question was, how do you deal with like the lease issues, even in terms of like leasing the equipment, not as directly as a one-to-one relationship, but because that person was no longer going to be a farm manager, could they live on the property? Did they have to pay rent now? Did they pay rent as of January? So on and so forth.
Can you give an example of pesticides? I'm like, my brain's like, oh, drift, but I don't know what that was.
Well, pesticides could be. So, if somebody is going and they have drifting pesticides, I'm assuming that's what you're talking about, that can be. Also, though, even disagreements. So I had one that was half of the operation wanted organic farming, half of them wanted traditional farming. So then the state of play is the concept of pesticides. So pesticides can also be part of it if it's a compliance issue with whatever kind of contract you have as well.
And is mediation in Iowa mandatory for all of these issues or just for the financial disputes?
For the financial disputes, but the way Iowa law is written is that if there's any finance tied to a homestead on ag, it has to be mediated. So sometimes we get some unusual ones because, in other words, somebody maybe has used their farm homestead as collateral for something else. Those have to be mediated.
But you couldn't demand and get mediation over like a pesticide drift case. Okay.
Those would be the ones that would be offered. So, and these are the ones here that are probably universal among all the states that it's going to be a voluntary thing, unless their state has written it that way. Okay. So here are some of the other ones. Family farm transitions. This is important to know because prior to the 2018 Farm Bill, this was not part of mediation services. And that's why it can sometimes be confusing for people. Like, why would I go to a mediator for farm transition issues? But research has shown that is farm succession planning easy? Does everybody agree it should happen though?
Yes.
But again, is it easy? So the elements that come out in mediation apply to family farm transitions. And the other thing, I don't know if I have it in the slides, but every agricultural mediation program to be in USDA compliance has to certify and continually train their mediators according to the parameters. So like when I teach at the International Farm Transition Network, and I think there was 26 people this morning, 5 were from another state because they are part of an ANT program and want to stay up on certification. So rest assured that if you're working with the state, they're staying in it. And this is a very specific kind of training compared to other ones.
Just one other clarifying question. So in a farmer-neighbor dispute, both parties would have to agree since it's not mandatory. Is that correct?
Yep. So a farmer and this is and like how he just keeps supplanting and normally in a farmer neighbor, it would be like, I don't like the noxious odors that are being created here, like something like that. However, a farmer neighbor dispute, if it is a debtor creditor issue, could fall under that because there are times we think of creditors as being banks and creditors, but there's private contracts too. So if somebody is privately contracted with somebody, so
This may come back to the next question about pesticide drift, but is there an equivalent of like class action mediation? Like could a group of people say like, we don't want these kinds of pesticides, like organophosphates shouldn't have been brought back. Can that be mediated?
Hold that thought.
Okay, sorry.
Because yes,
Amazing.
amazing. I'll talk about my very first mediation in Iowa. I'm thrilled. Okay. And then the last is whatever is designated. So to answer your question, Ben, I can't tell you what individual states do. But if they do, then that can be written in, but it can't be just like, we want to do this. It has to be written into the recertification, because when we recertify, we are saying the services that we can or won't do.
Why can't you provide credit services when you are engaged with the USDA?
How, okay, can you repeat the question?
Why can't you provide credit counseling if it's a mediation?
Why can't you?
Yeah, isn't that? And
You can't provide credit.
but
counseling.
before it involved the USDA. So if you're mediating between someone and the USDA, are you allowed to provide credit counseling?
If your state wants to do so. So the question for those in the audience is, can you have credit counseling as part of your services? It is a layer of complexity, just like the farm transition. Not every state is going to offer this because it is a specialized type of thing. And so not every state will necessarily have credit counseling as part of their services. And so that's why it's important for everybody to get to know their own state. And in fact, I would say most people offer what I would call credit counseling light, that they're going to help in processes, but maybe not have an official credit counseling program, because you have to administer it, you have to be an expert on it, you have to stay seasoned in it. So does that answer the question?
I guess I'm struggling with like the USDA aspect. It seems like this is saying like if it's mediation between a person and the USDA, you can't do credit counseling for that person. Am I misunderstanding that?
I think you might be misunderstanding, because that is part of the process, is talking through the lending relationship. And keep in mind that everything that falls under here doesn't necessarily mean the person's only sitting with the USDA. USDA cases in the spectrum of mediation cases is pretty small. Most of them fall in other things, like a bank and a farm, or a neighbor and a farm. Cool.
So the last bullet point is credit counseling is required before mediation with USDA.
Is it provided? No.
Is it required or no?
I think I'm it says it can be offered if
Okay.
it is involving.
And it's a may.
It's
Right.
optional
The whole-
if it involves USDA.
The whole logic behind that, though, is to keep costs down, even for the consumer, because if they can get that as part of it. But what we have, like FinPac and those things that exist, a lot of people do other things prior to, so there isn't a demand that they have to do it. It's an offer to.
So this can be offered before the mediation occurs. Okay.
Clarify question. So when you're saying credit counseling, it's not a mediation, it's like just like dealing with the person's finances. And so is this specific to mediation between the party and the USDA, or just to be covered to be paid for USDA mediation?
Most people, if they're going to have a credit counseling service, are going to have it broader than just USDA cases,
Yeah.
because you're not going to have an infrastructure there that is piecemeal, if that makes sense. The idea is that they're trying to capture people with education on their finances before they decide that they need to file. So in other words, before they get into the throes of facing foreclosure, and there needs to be a way to count that as a service. And some states, like Iowa and Minnesota, that isn't part of our practice because our caseload is just very different. Does that answer no?
Yes. Yes.
Related with different. Does that counseling satisfy bankruptcy requirements?
And it depends. So like how I just answer everything like a mediator, and it depends.
So it depends on their certification
It,
level.
It depends on where they're at in the process too. So for instance, like in Iowa, you cannot mediate a case that's already entered into bankruptcy. And so those ones would get kicked out right away. And it would depend on the chapter that they're filing, lots of variables.
But I think to file for bankruptcy, you have to have first gone through credit counseling.
But my understanding, and you're the attorney as well, lean on you, but that's a loose definition too of what that actually means.
Yeah.
So I don't actually know how people
Okay, that's something I can look up.
meet that requirement, but it's my understanding that yes, that does, but I don't know what else also does. Phew, you all keeping me on my toes. Good questions.
Wait, one more.
Oh, yeah, go for it, man.
So USDA adverse decisions,
Oh,
you can request mediation before you go to like a NAT appeal. Did they kick that to you? And it's required?
yes, it's required to offer it.
Mhm.
And keep in mind that appeals are very time sensitive. So there's a lot of clock going in and out to regulate it because you have to pause, move, pause. So like in Iowa, we don't do a whole lot of adverse decisions. Because I'm actually, now that you say it, I'm not actually sure if it meets the threshold that it is required participation. But we do them. So an adverse decision, we can help people figure through that. What we have found, however, is that getting agreements on those are pretty hard for a variety of reasons. So see people shaking their head.
Sort of makes sense.
I'll just
He made me think, so whether or not it's required to participate in the mediation for the USC adverse decision, does that depend on if it's a required like case subject or not? Does that make sense?
So you're asking,
Like if it's an adverse decision and it's gonna go to an appeal, you said you weren't sure if it would be required to participate in mediation or not.
Mhm.
Does that depend on if it involves like a loan or something else?
it would depend on like the context, because if it's a loan, it could fall under the mandatory part.
Yeah.
So it really, yeah, I keep saying depends. But it does depend on what the adverse decision is about.
That makes sense.
By the end of this, you're going to say, she said a lot of stuff and all of it was great. So what to expect in mediation? Most mediations require a couple of hours. And that's important to note because what we don't want to have happen is people thinking, oh, it's going to be 30 minutes or an hour, and then they get right into the heart of having something work. So at my office, we would tell our coordinators to try to slate 4 hours, telling them that very likely it's going to be 1 to 2. But if I'm doing a farm facilitation, those take hours upon hours, weeks upon weeks, months upon months, years upon years. To answer your question about Zoom, so we are in a world now where most states will honor and recognize virtual mediations. One thing to keep in mind is that we often now use the word, I'm going to join on Zoom. There are banks, though, there are USDAs, there are agencies, there are places that mandate Microsoft Teams. So it's also important to know, like, what is the security involved? What is your knowledge and comfort? Because they're not the same beast. And what is interesting is that, have any of you been on any kind of Zoom mediation? So have they used breakouts or caucusing? Okay. So we're seeing head shaking. And what is impressive to note is that as mediators have gotten more comfortable with virtual practices, they can make it feel very similar to in person. So with breakout rooms or like caucusing rooms, The one thing to think about though, is that you also want to make sure that you have mediators that are in a state where people have bandwidth to do it. We make a lot of assumptions still about connectivity, what that means, people shaking their head. And as a mediator, how are you equipped with helping people who maybe are using their phone for Zoom versus somebody who maybe lives in a part that they're traveling. We have a lot of off-road truckers who do that in their season, and they choose to mediate from the road on their phones. One, how much can somebody concentrate if that's what they're doing? Is there even like a liability with that? Okay. So our practice is to ask people just to stop driving, right? Pull over. What we have found though is that it's not uncommon for people to get to a point where they don't have connectivity. And then what do you do? And so that happens more often now than you would think, given the world that we're in. If you are scheduling an in-person mediation, the mediator or coordinator is going to attempt to find a neutral location. And so as a rule, we're not going to be setting up shop at the bank just because they have a conference room. Probably not going to be setting up shop at the farmer's attorney's office. We are going to be looking for neutral locations. At IMS, we're lucky enough that we actually have facilities to do that. If you don't, mediators get very creative. You can do them at libraries, extension offices, courthouses. And actually, we have become a culture where more places are leaning towards courthouse-based mediation. Why do you think that is? Safety. Yep, because you don't have to ask somebody to be disarmed. It is going to be a natural requirement just walking in. Right? So, and we all might be like, but my, one of my best mediators worked with us for 30 years, and he had a case where somebody came in with their briefcase and said, "Don't worry, I have Smith and Wesson with me." And like, oh, that changes context. And that was prior to the era that we're living in right at this moment. And most mediators will tell you that there have been moments where people get very passionate about their views. And so the mediator's job is going to be to figure out, like, is this person who just needs to emotionally regulate? Or is this somebody where there is like a true safety concern? And that's not going to be a one size fits all for somebody's comfort level. I can handle just about anything coming my way because I have 20 years of HL experience, 10 years as a mediator. I'm the mom of 3 teenagers. I had a mediation about 6 months ago, where when we were in caucus, the person needed a cigarette break. We build that in because we know if somebody doesn't eat or go to the bathroom or smoke, are they going to be their best yes? No. And so we had a private session, and then he proceeded to tell 2 people who were observing, because they were training under me, that he was going to step on their throats and take them home. I shouldn't laugh, but your expressions are like, yep, that's what the 2 observers also did. For me, I was like, okay, moving on. Are you going to regulate yourself and hold yourself out? Don't talk that way again. And because we can be neutral about the conflict, we don't have to be neutral about somebody's safety, behaviors, things like that. And I knew from my years of experience, I'm like, he's testing the water. I have had some though where I'm concerned about if they will do self-harm. And so there isn't a magic perfect way, but that's why the mediators at Iowa go through mental health first aid. Because I want them to be equipped with knowing their comfort level. And just because I'm comfortable doesn't mean I'm ever going to require somebody else to be comfortable. Their threshold is their threshold, right?
What do you know what happened with the Smith and Wesson situation? Like, how did they handle that?
So the Smith and Wesson was he was full of BS. Wasn't in there. I had one though in the past year where I was dealing with a farm transition plan, and one of the family members didn't like the direction it was going. And after the session was done, they all left. Different sibling comes back in and says, I want you to know that I actually think you're in harm's way. And I think you should leave a different way because my sibling is gun carrying. And I tell you right now, is not afraid to use it. So I was like, that you pay attention to, right? Because, so, okay. And might be scaring people. Those are the exceptions, not the rule. Most people sitting with us, they're under stress. Like I try to remind myself, how many of us show up as our best yes? Think about how we show up when we're late in traffic. And that's not even as high risk. Think about like people who might be losing their whole legacy, farm ground, their whole family lives. So I try to balance out like, okay, how much of this are they responding to their own stress? And how much of this is real? I have had some spouses call me too and say that they were worried about their spouse with self-harm. So, but yes, Smith and Wesson ended up being nothing. Mine ended up being a little different.
You know, when you're mentioning that just makes me think of the sort of the dichotomy that for the farmer who's in mediation, everything is on the line. And for the creditor, you know, they're an employee of insert big bank here. Sometimes, you know, the program that we have reports that, you know, they show up and don't even have authority to agree to anything.
Oh, that happens all the time.
And so they just like, they don't have the same stake as somebody who's just about to lose everything. So how do you handle that? It's not exactly a power dynamic, but it kind of is.
It is. And the lived experience is different.
Yeah.
So I, as a practitioner, try to create shared understanding among groups. So I'll do a lot of the why to the what. And so most people kind of think, well, that bank can take it in the shorts. It's not personal to them. And vice versa. The banker might be like, you owe the money, pay it back. And so I try to come up with ways of having people understand why decisions are being made. So I might have the bank say, talk to the farmer about how we got to this decision to be here. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be happier, but what it can do is it can help them know that they're just not out there to attack them, right? And on the flip side, with the farmer, I'll say, you know, you feel very vested in the work you're doing here, right? Give that buy-in. And the banker, I'd like for them to talk about how they feel vested in this. What is their accountability if they don't get this note repaid? Because it might not have anything to do with how they feel about the bank, but they may need the job just as much as that farmer needs the job. They may care about their integrity with their work just as much as the farmer does. And so that's where having that conversation can help bridge. So I do a lot of like and conjoining people. And I try to focus on not necessarily win-win, but less lose. So in other words, even if the bank is going to get something that day, they probably aren't going to get the full amount. And actually in a mediation, if everybody leaves feeling a little bit like, look, you've probably done your job, right? And so if you can point out that this is like a collective difficulty together. We're here because we have a shared desire to see things move forward. They might not have the same direction they want to move forward, but everybody has the same desire to move forward, right? And so is our conversation taking us there? I ask 3 questions routinely in my practice. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? And the reason that I ask that is, I'm going to use this as my analogy. Those 3 questions are like a pamphlet, okay? So if I were to tell you that you could know everything about IMS from this front page, what would you say?
Simple.
And you would say, you're not going to learn everything, right? This is the where are we now? And a lot of times in these farm operations, people will keep talking about, where are we now? Like, we've always done it this way, or they're not, okay, they're staying here. So I want to move them to where do we want to be and how do we get there? So when they start having those conversations where it's like, they're not focusing on, you know, whether it's personal, I'm gonna say, okay, is the conversation we're having right now getting us to where we wanna be? And I make them take ownership of it. We have a line in mediation that we teach at IMS that says, don't work harder than the parties at the table.
Mm.
I mean, and so by that, and also care enough about the process not to care. I care enough about what I do as a practitioner to not get in the trenches with people's feelings. I care about their feelings to the extent that it's moving us forward. That makes sense?
So in that situation you have with that sibling game, how do you regulate yourself on your drive home?
Ha! Nobody said I regulate myself on the drive home, my friend.
Going 100.
So it is actually interesting. If people really want to know, one, I'm a highly aggressive person. If you were to take a class with me, I would do communication inventories with you. My background, interestingly and ironically enough, is psychology, human resources, and my doctorate is in alternative dispute resolution. And I can fight the best of them. That doesn't make any sense as a mediator, right? So what I have learned is my lived experience actually helps me. So like when I wrote this book, it was all about like, how do we form our thoughts about conflict? Because I have my own going on up here, right? So for me, I do have some grounding techniques. I go into a session, even here, when I say it's not about you, Kiley, it's about them. So when people ask questions, I'm like, absolutely. The gift is to you all. And so I'll tell myself the same thing about mediation or farm facilitation. I had one the other day where somebody went irate and started slamming their hands against the wall. That was the first that I had seen in 11 years. I had to do a quick check to say to myself, what is actually going on here right now? What could that symbolize? So I asked the question, and I am a person of faith, so a little bit going there. I asked the question and I said, I would like for you to talk to me about what I'm seeing right now. And she started to cry and she said, how many farm managers are also required to clean out the underwear of their mom and dad's house when they work? Doesn't that change the energy? So if you allow people to tell the story, and as a practitioner, I'm always going to be looking for subjective words. So if somebody says to me, I'm going to get to repaying this loan soon. What's the subjective word in there?
Soon.
Soon. Okay. I have 3 kids. I had 3 kids in 3 years, so really they should be very similar, right? But if I were to ask Zebulon what soon is, it would be, if I said 10 o'clock, 10 o'clock. If I asked my youngest one, an alpha who's just like whirling energy, it's going to be 10 minutes early. If I ask Blondie, my middle child, who knows when she's going to show up? Still her version of soon. So as a parent, if I gloss over that word, is it on them or on me that we don't have the same shared understanding? So part of agreement writing is also saying, do we understand what the words are that we're using in the agreement? And things that can really get people in technical trouble is they'll use words thinking that everybody understands the same thing, right? And so as a mediator, I'm going to say, okay, play that out for me. What does repaying the note mean? What are the notes with specificity? What are the dollar amount? How is it going to be paid? And I would do the same thing even in a farm succession plan. So part of how I'm able to regulate, I'll try to pull it back, is that over my years, I have been able to de-escalate cases by understanding I'm not the smartest person in the room. So I sit there all the time and I'm asking the questions, tell me more about that, help me understand. Because usually in doing that, most people will come to their own language, their own understanding, shared consensus, and that regulates things right away. Because as soon as that person was slamming their hands on, and I asked that question, and I said, I want us to take a minute to breathe that in. I want you to sit with that thought for a moment. And then when you're ready, we're going to move forward. You're fine. it was like, but had I just been like, well, what the, I mean, that's inappropriate. Is it inappropriate? Yes. Do we all do things that are relatively inappropriate at times? So can we give some grace and mercy along the way? So as a practitioner, that's how I'm able to do it. And my thought process, and I would hope this would be the same for all of you, whatever you're doing in life, if you can end the end of the day and know that you were given your best of intention with the hope of the best impact, then I'm like, that's all I can do, right? So I totally went off script there.
So when you are in a situation like I do hotline too, and sometimes you answer that phone call and anything can happen. And you wanna know more because obviously I don't know what you're happening. You're going through. So saying like tell me more, is that okay? Like in a neutral way? Like because I don't understand your situation.
Yep. So if you do, like in Iowa, they have an Iowa Concern hotline as well, started about the same time. I try to picture whether it's a Zoom or a phone call, how would I want somebody to interact with me if they were right there? And so I ask the questions as though I would. So if it feels natural to do so, and if you have the time to do it, because I know some hotlines, you're time bound.
No, we're not.
So if you're not, then certainly is to just ask, would you be willing to share about it? Would it be helpful for us to walk through that together? I use a lot of we statements too, not like, hey, I want you to talk to me, but like, let's share together. And then I'm a practitioner, and this is not what everybody else does. If I can come up with a common bond, I will use that. There are practitioners who won't do that. But for me, if you're sitting there and like the person who said their underwear and whatever, I might not understand that experience. I can understand something about that. And so, for instance, for me, having lost my dad at a young age when I was 14, I don't want to commandeer the experience from them. I can, though, help them understand that I'm trying to see them where they're at. And that is a fine line because we also don't want to hijack people's experience and one up or whatever.
How do you navigate that line?
How do you navigate? So the question was, friends in the crowd, how do we navigate? It is more of an art than a science. And this is part of why I wrote this book. I'm totally sidetracking now. I was at Creighton University when I started my dissertation, and I decided to ask the question, how do you make mediation work? Because I'm like, how is it that you can offer the same curriculum, but people's skill sets vary so much? And I started thinking about Brene Brown. How many of you read Brene? Think she's all that, okay? Brene Brown is steeped in qualitative, not quantitative research. So I wanted to hear the story. So I went out and I interviewed agricultural mediators from across the nation who had at least 5 years of experience, and I just asked them that question. Here's what I found interesting though. Every single one of them gave me a metaphor instead of answering the question. So they would say something like, I'm a mediator who's like a symphony conductor. It's not just the notes, it's the space between the notes. That's how I make mediation work. Okay? That was all fine and good until I got to the one that said, I'm like Wayne Gretzky. I was like, so who is Wayne Gretzky? Hockey player? Does that sound like conflict resolution and peacekeeping? So had I just pushed right past it and been like, okay, weirdo. No, instead I said, tell me about that. And you know what he said? Wayne Gretzky was the best ever because he knew enough not to skate to where the puck was, but where it's going to be. And I try to skate to where it's going to be in mediation. Well, I'm like, well, dang. But my takeaway was when I asked people then how they came up with it, everybody's metaphor had to do with their own lived experience. So in other words, the hockey person, that was entrenched with them. Whereas the symphony one, that was entrenched with them. What we tend to do though, is we tend to use our own metaphors with people. And so that's why when he used the hockey metaphor with me, I was like, what is actually going on, right? Because that's not my lived experience. So when you ask like what the fine line is, it really is a practitioner who has figured out what their imagery is tied to conflict and how they can authentically sit in it. I have a practitioner at IMS who would never use personal narratives, that personal connection, and she is one of the best mediators in the world. I do though. And so what it really boils down to is like knowing yourself and really almost reality testing yourself after each session because it takes some practice. So when I finish something, I will ask myself, did I make that about myself or about the parties? If I had bias, was I able to present it neutrally? So I'm going to self-check. And the more you do that, the more you're going to know where the line is. And it's always an art. So again, I'm not answering these terms, but it's the truth. And so like in this book, and by the way, because you all decided that we're number one, everybody gets one. There is a section in here that I call farm tools. Because what I discovered is that if I talk to farmers about the psychology of mediation, what are they going to do?
Go to sleep.
Or worse yet, is that right? Okay. So what I had farmers start to do was envision a home remodel. How many of you have lived through a home remodel? Okay. And almost everybody would be, yeah. I'm like, okay. So then I want you to write down your tools. Write down what would be on the toolbox. So they write down 10. And then I said, now I'm wondering what tools are going to be at the top versus which ones are going to be at the bottom. Well, of course, the ones at the top are what? The ones we use more often, the ones we just use, the ones we're comfortable with. And so instead of talking about psychology, I would say we all have the tools that we lean into. And some of us are hammers, some of us are levels, some of us are pliers. And you'll actually see this in here, where that was the way to connect with them, was not to talk about the psychology, because again, then I'm making it about myself. Let's see if I can try that. So using the tools. And so what I did was, I actually have people do exercises, but I have a visual with the tool. And some of the tools are hammer, level, screwdriver, pliers. Could anybody guess what I am of those four? Hammer! Right. And people will say, well, what do we do if we're all one style or another? And then I talk about how, like, if we're going to build a window, we need all of it. We need the level, we need the hammer, and then eventually when we put that window in, the light comes through. And so I use a lot of analogies, but I've had to learn that the analogies I use can't be about me. So if those don't resonate, then just come up with something else that does. I use a lot of car analogies with people who like cars, and it just goes a long way. Because in my research, what I have found is that if something is important to you, but you can't name it, you're still going to feel it. Often that's when we reach out to symbols. That's why even in the cave era, what did we see when people were communicating? Not words, but symbols. So it is a common unifier among human beings. That's also what I do when, like, if somebody doesn't think it's personal to the banker, because there actually probably are elements of it that are personal to them. And so I try to get that symbol in there. If that makes sense. Okay. We do ask, I don't know if that's me or somebody else, but well, it could be they're saying, time for you to be quiet. We do ask in terms of the intake process, for people to bring documentation with them. You had mentioned that there are times when people mediate that they don't even have the authority. And so we try to, in our intake, let people know what the expectations are. So farmer, if you're coming to the table, maybe bring balance sheets, maybe bring accounting record, maybe bring contracts. If you're the bank, what is the payoff? What authority do you have? Who could you bring with you for authority? Okay. And then We also try to find out in our intake if people are going to be there or not. Not that people can't bring their invited guests, but every human being that you allow at a table changes the dynamics. And so I have a tendency to tell people that if they are a party to it, I'll have them sign the agreement to mediate. And all that means is they're agreeing to sit with us. And then everybody else who's there, in my delivery, I will say, we appreciate you being here as an invited guest. That wording shifts though, because there are a lot of attorneys, no offense to attorneys, when they sit there though, want to act like an attorney, and that's okay. However, they're still not the party to the agreement. Their client is whoever's sitting with them. Their client isn't the mediation agreement. That's my job. And so to remind them, you are an invited guest with your party. Because sometimes people try to hijack. So the mediation will begin by an opening statement. So we talk about the role, the process, who was at the session. Most mediators will have an outline that talks about confidentiality, what to expect, things of that nature. For me as a mediator, and actually for all of you, if you're dealing with high emotion, think about the environment that you set up and how it can create emotional and physical safety. Okay, so if you're a practitioner who is okay with people crying, maybe have some Kleenexes at the table, right? If you have concerns that people need to smoke, are you building in breaks for them or food? The other thing that I do is that I keep a clock behind the heads of people. Because the last thing that I want to do is be like, because what does that signal to somebody? Even if that's not what I'm trying to do, I could be just like, hey. And in the world of technology, we've had to start asking more questions about people recording sessions or not. Chicken right there. And so part of our process is actually talking about these sessions aren't to be recorded. And if you have your cell phone, it can be for uses other than that. And not every practitioner does that, but you have to weigh that out. Okay, so in mediation, we're going to give everybody the opportunity to talk. And part of my intake when I'm sitting with people and doing my introduction is I am a person that is going to say, we want to invite everybody to the table to talk. And to do that, I'm going to ask that people speak one at a time, knowing that everybody will be given the opportunity to speak. That's very different than I could say the exact same thing and say, don't interrupt. Feel the vibe though, how different that is? Because one's an invitation and a challenge and is really is kind of top-down based, right? And so what I'll do is I then will help people with their nerves. And I'll say, if you're somebody like me who has a lot of energy or whatever, that's why we set notepads out and pens. So if you have an idea, feel free to write it down. And if you get to the point where you really have something you want to say, just give me a little hand signal and I'll know that it's time for you. Because that in and of itself will reduce interruptive behaviors because people know they're going to be heard. Sometimes people are just worried they're going to forget or not have a place at the table. Okay. And so at IMS, I talked about table mediation. We do use caucusing though, quite a bit when it comes down to like the actual settlement of like dollar amounts, things where people don't want to show, hey, I would actually accept this much, that much. So there is a space for caucusing. I also use caucusing if somebody needs to emotionally regulate. I want them to save face. So I'm not going to be like, yep, and you just threw a hissy fit. What I'm going to do is like, this would be a great time for us to break. So for my sake, could you all go to your respective spaces and I'm going to do a quick check-in. I make it about me so that, you know, they can still feel comfortable. Okay.
Just a quick logistical question. So in that case, you need a space that has 3 rooms?
Well, in a perfect world, you would have multiple rooms. IMS is lucky enough that we do. However, one of my first mediations was done at a big old gymnasium that had been turned to a community center. And it was one open space with a bathroom that was marginal at best and nothing else. So then you just have to think creatively. How can I create spaces? It could be weather depending, outside. You could end up being the shuttle diplomacy where if they have to stay there, you pull a party out and come back in. Not ideal, but you work with what you have. And I'm always trying to figure out as a practitioner before we start, like, how would seating make sense? How will those spaces make sense? Is there a place that we could go to? But yes, ideally, my first mediation, which was you asking about the civil, I had what's called a nuisance dispute, which is covered under Iowa law. And nuisance tends to be when a bunch of neighbors feel that a practice is impeding on their life. So it could be like windmills, depending on how you feel. It could be noxious odors. And so my first one had guaranteed over 50 people. Yep. And it was 50 people and it was an animal operation. So for sake of confidentiality, that's all I'll say about that. And so I had to figure out what does caucusing even look like. So I would have to herd like cats, get all these people into a room. And so we actually rented out a community space because I needed to have a place where all of them could go. And then when we were behind closed doors, I said, we probably all can't talk because do we have spokespersons who's going to speak on your behalf? So it's still a caucusing model, but you need to have one person or a couple people who are voicing. So yes, you can. It's not necessarily a class action, but in essence, it's class action light.
And I was just in a mediation with my first hybrid. Where partly for screen access, which reasons there was basically a conference room, the in-person people, the mediator doing a Zoom in his office. And so,
Yep.
And when you caucus, do you personally, the mediator, go into the one room for a little bit and then bop over to the other room? So you're in those spaces privately with those groups at some point.
Yep. So the question was, what do we do with caucusing space and time? And as a mediator, I'm very cognizant of that because 5 minutes, if you're talking to somebody, it's going to feel fast. But what does 5 minutes feel like to the person you're on in there? Forever, especially on Zoom. Because then they're sitting in a world. So I'm constantly asking myself, how do I balance, touch points? And so, but yes, it's the mediator who is normally meeting if you have rooms to do so. Sometimes, like I said, we have to shuffle whole groups, but good question. Okay, so now know your state requirements. So I've already talked about this, but I want to just touch in real quickly that in Iowa, it's code chapter 654. So I'm going to show you. This is some of the wording, okay? Won't belabor it other than for you to see that it has to do with agricultural property. And you see the $20,000, real estate, et cetera, et cetera. We also have 654B. And those are care and feeding contracts and nuisance. So a care and feeding one would be, let's say somebody's assets are going to be in jeopardy because somebody hasn't cared for it. So in other words, you haven't given vet care to animals, or you haven't been feeding them properly, or you're taking them away from an area. So that's a very specific kind, and that is one that the Farm Bill would say is mandatory because our state has indicated it's required. And then nuisance. So the care and feeding ones are interesting because they are also getting more complex. We had one where it was based on the embryos of it was well, may make sense, right? But who would have thunk back in 1985 probably wasn't on their radar when they were writing this. But it fell under it and we dealt with it. Okay. Okay, so the other reason why it's important to know what your state does is because the state will then also determine how it's processed. So in the state of Iowa, I'll just give a quick highlight reel. Case comes in, has to be sent by law by certified mail. So if it's not sent by certified mail, it is not considered a qualifying case. First thing, once we get it, we have 3 days that we have to turn it around and notify the parties. Once that 3 day starts, parties have 21 days to tell us if they want to engage in services or not. If they say yes, the next 21-day window starts and we then coordinate. So from start to finish, it could be 42 days plus the 3 days from the time that we get a case to the time that we handle it. But that's actually rapid speed. I mean, there are some states where it's months. So when we're coordinating and we're talking about those 32 cases that come in, that could be a bugaboo, right? Because all 32 cases started on the same day, same notification window. Okay, so it's important to know not just the code or the statute or what your state says, but also what that does for impact by timing, things of that nature. So we talked about preparation by way of documents makes mediation work. Also, if you're working with people who are trying to get to the table of mediation, what else is there? It's easy for us to think only of the transactional pieces, the financial and legal pieces. However, it's a layer though. Have we ever seen somebody dig in on something that's really not transactional? There's an emotional tie, like the divorced couple that cares about the bedroom furniture. Is it about the bedroom furniture? Is it about something else? Okay. And then also, are you talking to the family members? In farm operations, even if they're not signed on a note or part of the mediation, the decisions impact people. What are the goals? What proposals? To your point, what can they even do? Because it's one thing if a bank sits there and like, yep, I want to forgive that debt or forgive that loan, and they can't. So what can you do? And then we talked about reality testing. And again, that's just simply phrasing it with people. Play this out to the logical or illogical end. Play it out for the short term and the long term. To just know how likely the agreement is. And I'll remind people, because I'm a short-term intervention, you live with what you write in the agreement. So we're going to reality test because you are the ones that have to see this to fruition. Because keep in mind, if somebody breaks the agreement, what can then happen? Legal action, right? Which is the whole point of what we're trying to avoid for them. And then keep in mind that as you have clients, parties, most mediation centers will offer other things. I do a lot in faith-based, I do a lot in family disputes, and I do a lot in education. That's important to know because somebody can be sitting with you in a state of like despondency, and there could be other things that if they could get a mediation on, they could be more rooted, better prepared for the other facets of life. Because for instance, let's say I can't repay a debt for a farm. And we find out that they have some medical expenses due to a medical thing. That could be something totally separate and apart, but does it influence and impact what's going on over here? Absolutely. So also find out what your respective states can do. Okay, and so then why mediate? In the white paper, research shows there's lots of dollar amounts, but essentially 90% of anybody that goes through a mediation will say that they would do it again if they could. So that tells you that when they get there, and that means that even people who don't necessarily reach a formal agreement still see benefits. So last slide. This is IMS. As I said, I'm located in West Des Moines. If you want to know more about CAMP, you also have the handouts in the middle, all the resources that are there. And Ben has another question.
So say parties have reached an agreement in principle.
Mhm.
Do you help them draft an agreement or do you not help at all until they have to do it?
No, we'll write the agreements for them. As long as it's in their words and it's memorialized their way. Not every party wants to do it that way. So the question was, how do you do agreement writing? Some attorneys want to write them on behalf of their, and that's fine. A skilled mediator, like if you go through IMS's training, we have a whole section on agreement writing. Like taking their words, making sure it has the SMART goals in it. Is it specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, timely? And then memorializing it. But when I write it, I also will tell them, this is a draft until you sign it. That way it can keep being reworked. So there's still conversation until that last signature comes in.
If one party's not represented by counsel and one is, do you recommend that the non-represented party find counsel?
So the question is, what do you do if there are power disparities? And in this case, what do you do if one person is represented by counsel and the other isn't? It's really not very neutral to say that they have to get an attorney. So instead, what I would be doing is I would, again, reality test, play that out. I noticed that we're without an attorney. Talk to me about how you came to that conclusion. What are the risks and the rewards of that? And then, because if they are genuinely comfortable without it, then I need to honor the neutrality of the process and that it's party driven. If they say they need something though, then I'm going to say, okay, let's visit that. And really, in our intake, before people even get to the mediation table, we should be asking them questions like that. Who's going to be there with you? That way, they're not just coming to the table and they're like, oh, dang, I have one that's represented and one that's not. You should try to be pretty educated beforehand. So, I'm down to about 30 seconds. I'm going to ask the question.
I wanted to know more about the mandatory versus non-mandatory states. Like, how is that determined?
How's it determined?
Yeah,
Determined by the states and their ability to get government officials, lobbyists, all the parties to agree or not to agree to it. So the vast majority are not mandatory. It is a heavy lift to become a mandatory state. And there's philosophical differences there. So in our case, it's under the Attorney General. It's written us into the rules. I can't speak to Minnesota other than I know that they are in Minnesota law, but I don't know who is governed or advocated for that.
Do you know the other mandatory states, like how many?
Last I checked, I think there was like 5 or 6.
Oh,
Not very. And the ones who are mandatory have really kind of been since time immemorial, and we're probably some of the first in. So, want to honor people's time. You don't have to take a book if you don't want to. This book was based on my doctorate and dissertation, and then this is a workbook. It's 52 exercises. So in other words, presumably you can do one a week if you want. You can do it with teams. You can do it yourself. So if you're a person that like knows about devotionals, things like that, it's that concept. A lot of like levity in there, but it helps you get the practice of what this is.
Cool.
Oh,
After I say it's voluntary, I force my association. So,
No, I don't.
no, I don't want the vote. Thank you all for being so
Thank
grateful.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.